Hello everyone. I think if you're anything like me, you might have not had the best week last week. Coronavirus is causing problems again. We had the tragic news about the Chinese airliner, and of course that comes on the back of increasing conflict throughout the world, and of course a couple of tough years also due to the pandemic and other factors. And what I've seen recently, indeed, a lot of people are sharing a general feeling of pessimism and frustration and anxiety about what's happening in the world right now and their own futures and humanity's future even, because we do see a lot of negative news, that's for sure. And that's why today I wanted to make a video why I still think you should be optimistic, and I still think there's a lot of optimism about humanity's future despite what you may see and feel. The first thing I would say is now is still the best time possible to be alive as a human being. It may not feel that way, and indeed those of you who've been touched by tragedy definitely won't feel that way, but statistically it is true, scientifically it is true. If you just look at this chart, the average human life expectancy is rising exponentially. Just a couple hundred years ago, you'd be relatively fortunate to make it in your middle ages. Now, of course, we will expect to do so. And you can look at any number of metrics, health metrics, disease metrics, wealth metrics, even war metrics, and people dying in conflicts. Proportionally speaking, humans have been on a very strong path of progress, and we continue to be so. Indeed, you could probably just ask your own parents and grandparents to understand how much better our lives are today than they were then. And so it still is the best time to be alive, even though, of course, like every generation, we suffer our problems and have our difficult moments and difficult years even. Indeed, even the coronavirus, as terrible a pandemic as it has been, in historical context, we're still doing well, and we still have a lot of cause for optimism. We have all the equipment needed to deal with eventually and contain the virus. If I was to look at, say, the Black Death in Europe at around about 1350, killed around about 25 million people in a few years, which is approximately, I believe, a third of the continent's population at the time. You think about that. 1/3 of the people died in Europe from that disease, and they had no idea what it was. Absolutely no idea. They thought it was God's punishment, many of them, but at the end of the day it was, again, bacterial infections, rats, I believe. And so, here we are today, again, relatively fortunate position compared to our human ancestors. And so, whilst if you've been touched directly by tragedy, these macro figures will not mean much to you. But if you're feeling a general sense of pessimism about where humanity is and where our position in the world is right now, I would urge you all to think of these things, that you really did win the lottery to be born as a human being in the modern day. Second thing I'd say is we are bombarded by pessimism. Pessimism sells, to be honest. It gets you clicks. In the West, at least, it sells newspapers, definitely. And that's because if you report things going well or things working as they should, it doesn't sell anything. Nobody's interested in that. And therefore, you're naturally going to be exposed to more pessimistic news stories. That's combined with the human predisposition towards negative disaster thinking, which I covered in another video, part of our evolutionary heritage. And therefore you've got this unfortunate coincidence of increasingly pessimistic sources of information combined with a pessimistic interpretation on our brain, which comes together to form, of course, a very depressing worldview. You need to fight this and understand both the selection bias in the information you may be receiving, together with the bias from your own mind, and understand that, things generally do work. Things generally do go okay. Finally, don't underestimate humans' abilities to overcome challenges, even ones today that seem insurmountable. I want to take you back to the 1920s. In the 1920s, if you cut yourself and your blood got infected, or it was a serious infection, you could die. In fact, there are all manners of things that we think were completely trivial diseases, which were fatal to people living in the 1910s and the 1920s. Enter Alexander Fleming. Alexander Fleming was a sloppy scientist. He was researching Staphylococcus, a type of bacteria. He went on holiday. He didn't clean his petri dishes. He came back, discovered mold in one of his petri dishes, but lo and behold, around and in and around that mold, the bacteria had been killed. And it was from that discovery that he figured out that this mold was secreting something that would ultimately become penicillin, a drug that saves millions and millions of lives and renders what were once terminal diseases completely innocuous to you and I. Why do I tell you this story? Well, two reasons. First, human beings can overcome insurmountable problems. No one would have imagined a drug like penicillin could have existed at the turn of the 20th century. Second, it happened completely by accident. Alexander Fleming didn't go out looking to discover penicillin. He discovered probably one of the most important drugs in humanity's history entirely by accident because he didn't clean his petri dishes. And that gives me a tremendous amount of hope, because you do not know where salvation will come from. And it can come from many, many different areas and to many, many different people. And for that reason, despite the numerous challenges that are facing us right now, I firmly believe that humanity's best days are ahead of us.